Hey, welcome back, everybody. Of course, my name is Dr. Keith McNally, and this is the the Question Guy podcast. And I want to say it. I want to say it. This is season two. I always say season two because the first 40 episodes were fantastic, but things get better as we go along. Once again, I'm here with Damien Mulligan, and we're going to talk about a phrase that I am now only becoming more familiar with. Damien,
So eco-anxiety
eco
is,
anxiety. So
is the topic that I'm concerned with.
So, so we got to define it. I have to understand a bit more about it. And the first time we talked about it, a question was posed to you in some type of situation that you were giving a talk. And I love the question because it actually inspired me to write, because I wrote a book. I just finished writing a book.
Yeah.
And part of that idea of, you know, the question was, should we not have children,
hmm
and so much of an idea, and that really talks to the idea of eco anxiety. Damien, what is eco anxiety?
It does talk to it, because some people who have eco-anxiety, look at things like the future and say, I don't really want to go there. So eco-anxiety really is the sense of fear or dread or worry that some people experience when they consider climate change. Climate change is something that, whether we like it or not, it is happening. And it probably makes sense to talk a little bit about climate change because that in itself probably describes to some extent um, why it is that some people feel this way, feel anxious about the climate. So, and without going into too much detail, because there's a lot of science behind all of this, and I'm not going to claim that I'm an expert in climate change, but I've started to become quite knowledgeable on elements of climate change. But I focus specifically then on people's behaviors and reactions to it, because that's something that really interests me. And it's something that, as we were talking about previously, um, when my kids ask me those questions, why don't we change? It really prompted me to think of look at the problem in more detail and think, why don't we change? So let's talk a little bit about climate change. And fundamentally, climate change is the change in long-term weather patterns that is happening as a result of um, the emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases, the emissions that make their way into the atmosphere and then either trap the sun's radiation or sunlight so that um, when that radiation attempts to make its way from the planet, it gets held in. And that might not sound like a bad thing. The planet gets
Just,
warmer.
yeah,
Exactly.
but in certain areas of the planet, that would be a bad thing.
And the reality is it's a bad thing overall for us because a lot of people will associate with the images of, let's say, the polar bears when you hear about climate change, the ice sheets melting and or the glaciers melting and the polar bears, um, their habitat being reduced. And that is one element of this. But what that means is that then, as a result of that, water levels are rising. So,
Well, can I ask you a real quick question?
yeah,
Is it true? I mean, are things melting? Are water levels rising? Like, and should coastal regions be concerned about that? Um, s- and is it significant enough to be concerned about it?
it is unfortunately, most definitely. All of the different behaviors that are caused by climate change are significant in the sense that um, if we look at the 3 years up to 2019, there was $650 billion worth of uh, expenditure related to climate disasters. Starkly enough, in the US, 415 billion of that was in the US,
Wow.
related to heat waves, related to hurricanes, and so forth. So it is pretty significant. And in the normal course of things, we don't probably notice it as much because nobody is here, you know, who recalls what it was like exactly 90 years ago or 120 years ago or 200 years ago to say we didn't have that many of these incidents or whatever. But it is something that is becoming more common. And the predictability of weather events is much more challenging as well now because of those changes in patterns. So you asked the question. Sorry, I've got notifications coming up here. I'm gonna shut them off.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
You asked the question, are the water levels rising? And they most certainly are, because there are some small Pacific islands that are starting to become inundated with water. And they say that by 2050, some of those islands will be literally just the peaks of mountains.
Wow.
And what we're experiencing in a lot of places around the world is that local councils and governments are making plans for, you know, shoring up their or, you know, placing barriers between the sea or the ocean and their townlands in order to avoid what will inevitably happen. And it is inevitable. There's no doubt about that. And the reality is that the ice caps won't solidify again. It's a case of how do we manage our way through certain things like that.
So wait a second. So based on that statement alone, we are on a collision. It sounds like one of those movies. We're literally on a collision course. It's just a matter of time. We're on a collision course with disaster. Yes? No? I mean, that sounds bad.
We certainly could be, and this
Okay.
is why people get anxious about it,
Okay.
because it's an indeterminate amount of time. We don't know how long it's going to take for some of these things to happen, although some things are already happening. You know, there are countries around the world at the moment where food security is a genuine risk because crop growth has either slowed or stopped, or the yield is lower than it used to be because of extreme temperature. And we talked before about the likes of Pakistan, and it was, I had kind of missed some of the news related to that recently, but up to 22 million people have been displaced in Pakistan in the last 6 months as a result of flooding in the country. 22 million people. So it's not as if this is not something that's happening, or it's not something that's serious. But when it's far away from us, we don't tend to notice it as much.
Right.
I was actually in Sligo at the weekend, so I come from the northwest of Ireland, and I grew up there, beside the sea, beautiful spot, beside the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean,
Yeah.
beautiful spot. And I realized that when I went down to walk on the beach, that the dunes that used to exist at the back of the beach onto a beautiful golf course pretty much no longer exist. So there's
Wow.
about 30 meters of dunes that don't exist anymore because the sea is encroaching more and more every year. So they've basically put barriers there, rocks and other silt and stuff to try and keep the sea from encroaching more. That's relatively small. It doesn't cause an awful lot of pain, but they are saying that by the likes of 2070, for instance, parts of Dublin City will be completely covered in water, lower lying parts. So the portlands, for instance, unless they build those up, they will be covered in water. Florida, at this point in time, many towns in Florida are actually have plans in order to try and keep the sea from encroaching further upon the townlands, and making plans also to try and encourage people to move away from areas that are close to the ocean. So these things are happening, most definitely. Most of the time, we're not aware of them. And as I was saying earlier, you know, somebody says, well, the habitats that polar bears are in is diminishing. Well, nobody really knows a polar bear. You know, we're not going to associate necessarily with something that is distant like that. But for people who do think about it, it becomes very worrying, because a lot needs to happen in order to slow this process down, and that's effectively what we need to do, is to slow the process down. So that carbon dioxide and other gases that are being released into the atmosphere, they warm the planet up. that's been happening since the beginning of time. That has been happening since the beginning of time.
But it's accelerated.
Exactly, and
Okay.
that's the issue, is that human activity, so cement production, um, the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, and so forth, as well as deforestation, means that we're actually the balance is being offset. So the ecosystem that Earth is a fairly delicate one.
Mhm.
So in the past, whatever was output was effectively being sequestered back in via trees, the oceans, and so forth. So there was that balance there. They're running out of capacity to do that. The rate of deforestation means there are less trees. The oceans are becoming very acidic as a result of the amount of carbon dioxide and other gases that are being absorbed, which, for example, is the reason why vast portions of the coral reefs, for let's say of Australia, are bleaching themselves, because the acidity in the ocean is doing that. So these are things that have been happening for literally the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. But we've had an awareness for the last 20 years as to how serious it could be. And therefore, science has looked at this and said, okay, there are things we need to change. And burning fossil fuels, for instance, is one of the largest, I suppose, impacts that's caused, and therefore it's something that we need to look at. We need to look at renewable technologies, renewable energy, and so forth. So that's the climate side of it. And as you say, that's worrying. If you think about
Well,
that.
it's not just worrying again, because there have been an increased number of these natural disaster movies. Now they're
Mhm,
typically low budget, the sun's going to blow up or this whatever. So all the way back from the 80s or 90s, from
mhm,
Twister, where there's an unusual number of tornadoes in
yeah,
in an area. And then I live in Virginia, so
yeah,
up and down the East Coast, United States, from Florida to Maine, and right here in my backyard is Virginia Beach. And so
yeah.
if the Atlantic Ocean is rising, then it's very it's not immediately impacting me, but it is in my basically it's in my backyard.
Exactly. And the reason why many people get anxious about this is, as you say, it's in my backyard. It's something that is there, but gradually becoming a reality.
Mhm.
And if you look at it back to the point about, you know, somebody not wanting to have kids, they look at future generations and ask the question, what are they going to do? How are they going to deal with this stuff? We're creating a problem for them. So that causes anxiety. Aside from the direct health impacts that climate change itself causes, mental health is affected. And there have been a number of surveys that have been done in different countries and across countries as well, that indicate that increasingly more and more people have this on their mind. They're either worried about or anxious about climate change. And for me, that's where the leadership thing starts to be of interest, because it is in the face of any adversity, I think, first off, that humanity is at its best. We can dig deep in times of any kind of adversity, and leadership in that context doesn't need to be, dragging people along behind me, but it needs to be, or it can be things like how I react to this and how I deal with it, how I encourage other people to deal with it and
Mhm.
consider it. And therefore, from our perspective, we're looking at, our leadership, and the reason why I and the group of people who are working with me on this don't necessarily feel anxious about it is because we feel we're doing something about it. We're getting something off the ground that can do something about it. Um,
But
Therefore,
the scale is global. It's not
the scale is
just
up. The scale
it's
is
not just in
absolutely,
Ireland.
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely, absolutely. Um,
So you need a global team to feel better.
well,
Or at least
so
as an idea.
yeah, absolutely. But start small and grow. I think it's down to that mentality that I have of breaking a problem up into smaller pieces that allows me to feel comfortable with that there are future steps that we're going to have to take, and those are bigger and bigger steps. But at the same time, if we don't do anything about it, you know, the situation is going to get worse for all of us. But also, it will make me and others alongside me feel, okay, we haven't done what we could have done about this.
Well, then let me ask you, since this is about eco-anxiety, and in our initial conversation, that question was raised. The young
Mm,
couple asked, did we make a mistake having children? And apparently they had young children. And you have children and I have children.
mhm,
Since that time, and that was probably mid-year,
mm.
2022, around that time that conversation I think occurred. Has there been any other, you know, just outright blatant to you, you know, just asking you for either permission or some type of assurance that the future is we're going to survive it?
Yeah, so we get that on a constant basis
Okay.
because when people understand what it is we're looking to achieve, they ask questions, and there's a variety of responses. I mean, we
Well, I'd like
have,
to know the
have
questions first. What kind of questions
well,
are being
some of the
asked?
questions like, is it too late? Is there
Okay,
nothing we can
that's a
do?
legitimate question. Yeah,
Exactly, and their anxiety and a question like that
yeah.
most certainly are linked. What can we do? Isn't it somebody else's problem? Surely governments or industry or whatever are the ones that really can make a difference here. And those are legitimate questions. And just to some extent, you can say, yes, it is government or industry that needs to do something about it. But ultimately, they won't do anything about it unless we, as the consumer, as the individuals, as the people who put them in power, or whatever our role is, actually use our influence to make those things happen. So um, when people ask about, it's interesting when people ask about what we're doing first, we explain it to them, and they say, "Well, I don't think I'm eco-anxious." And then we describe a little bit more about it, and they say, "Well, maybe I am in your target market," which is an interesting thing because once we start to talk a little bit about it, something like the questions you're asking, they start to get concerned and wonder what the future will bring, particularly if it's somebody who has already been aware of climate change.
Well, I think the issue is it happens in such small increments, like the encroachment of the ocean or the melting of the glaciers, um, the increasing temperature, the abnormal types of weather conditions we have, small increments
Yeah.
throughout. But now, we've had some very late storms this year around so typically we have hurricane season in
Yeah.
the eastern US, and it occurs from like June through November, and we're getting late, and I think there's one coming. I think there's one building now that we're having later storms, and we've never, to my knowledge, and I'm half a century old, we've never had late storms. And typically, even in my area, which is Florida to the Virginia,
Yeah.
if we get a storm in September, it's usually big, but then that's it. Then, next year, next June. But now we're getting these late storms, and we've had some really freaky snowstorms up in New York. And so
Hmm.
Buffalo, like earlier, like a month ago, 6 feet of snow in
Wow.
Buffalo in 24 hours. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I
And
don't know if that's climate change related, but again, weird things are happening. Just
yeah,
abnormal
the
things.
probability it is somewhat related. It may not be directly related, but the probability is it's somewhat related. What they say is, what the science says is that the predictability and the frequency of these events is well, the predictability is more challenging and the frequency is higher.
Oh,
Um, I keep mixing those two terms in as if they can be used the same way.
so
So
basically we
therefore,
can't, we can no longer trust our instruments, or
It's the longer term predictability because the weather patterns can change more rapidly. So
Okay.
typically weather patterns have a cyclical nature.
Right.
Over the last 2.5 billion years, there have been 5 ice ages. It's we have these cyclical patterns on Earth. We're actually supposed to be in a cooling period at the moment, but
But
we're in a warming period
yes.
because of our activities, our human activities, basically, increasing the temperature of the planet.
Wow.
So the temperature of the planet at the moment is about 30 degrees higher than it should be based upon models that they've used, historically assessing how these weather patterns actually work, which 30 degrees is quite significant overall
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
the planet.
I can imagine.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm sweating right now.
yeah.
But that's only
but
because my air conditioner's not, well, my air conditioner, only because my heat's on because it's cool outside.
But
But
if I can though,
go ahead, go ahead.
the point you're making there is a good one, which is that these are occasional events. So therefore, we're not necessarily looking at it as a disaster or something um, that is impacting us across wider society. It's the ones who are aware of it and understand why it's happening that it is concerning them. Because unless we change our behaviors now, it will continue to happen, and we'll get worse. You'll see more frequent. You will see these challenges with, let's say, because of high or low temperatures, that crops are not going to survive, or they're not going to do as well as they would have in the past. Or you'd have continued instances of the oceans encroaching on our lands. And that concerns people because, in instances like that, people will want to migrate and move to other locations. Fundamentally, if I'm on an island that's disappearing underwater, I'm going to get out of there, and
Yeah.
therefore there are other countries that are going to be in the early stages of this, and to some extent we're seeing it already in some countries, are going to see a lot of people migrating to those locations to get away from um, something that is slowly happening at the moment, but could begin to happen more rapidly. Because again, our activities, our human activities on the planet, our consumption, I'll say, our use of plastics, which is, plastics come from petrochemicals, which are oil and gas again, is increasing. Our consumption, and I'm going to say to some extent, possibly unnecessary, is increasing at a rate that will only make the problem worse unless we turn that around, unless we actually change our energy sources, unless we take action on various different things that we can take action on. And while it's unlikely in the short term to be able to reverse the impacts, the science does say that we can slow it down, and we can get to a point where that balance, the ecosystem balance that I was talking about, can be achieved again
Yeah.
by us reducing what it is our outputs are of our carbon emissions are. Yeah. So there's the starting point of how we address this from an eco-anxiety perspective. Is there are a number of elements, but one, we actually know the changes we need to make. We know the policies that need to change. We know the products, the services, the technology that needs to be used in order to make these changes. So that's the starting point of helping somebody feel comfortable with, we can do this. And then to some extent, use that anxiety. So anxiety is not always a bad thing. It's our fight or flight mechanism.
Yeah.
So if we use that anxiety to actually get engaged and involved in the problem rather than, flight, if we fight, we can encourage the right behaviors or changes in behaviors across a broader demographic of society, and encourage more knowledge about it as well. And that's where we want to tackle the problem.
So can we talk about that for just a little bit? Because your brand is, you're at the intersection of leadership and climate change. And so we've spent some time talking about climate change. Can we talk about leadership?
Yes. So fundamentally, my belief is that in each one of us there is a leader in some areas of our lives, some area of our lives. I think that by encouraging that, then we can we can get a certain amount of gratification ourselves that we're able to make a difference, but it encourages other people then to follow suit to a certain extent. So the things that individuals can do in relation to climate change, or in relation to their anxiety even, is to talk about it. Like, one of the first things that is encouraged in the context of anxiety and certain other mental health issues is to talk about it to other people. Now, it doesn't have to be to say, "Oh my God, this is terrible. I don't know what we're going to do about it."
The sky's
But
falling, right? Yeah, no.
exactly,
Chicken
it doesn't
Little.
have to be. It doesn't have to be that. And listen, there are some people like that. I had a very interesting discussion just 2 weeks ago, which, no point in going into the details of it, but this was somebody who understands the science so much,
Yeah.
but is at a point where he said there's nothing we can do. And fundamentally, I don't believe in that. And most science will tell you that that's not the case. But if we then step out of whatever view we have of the problem and take a step back and say, what is it that I can do? And I, as an individual, I can change my eating habits, or I can change my consumption habits. I can also use my influence, as I mentioned, speaking with other people. I'm concerned about this, and this is what I do. And what that will encourage is other people to, if they haven't already, to consider the problem. But if they have, you start to develop a kind of community around that. And that in itself is leadership. And it's the kind of leadership that we need across society as well, to encourage people who can take action in particular areas to do just that, and to align with others who are also interested in solving the problem, but also who have the ability to, through their influence, through their day-to-day activities, to make some difference. And the other element of the brand that we talk about is every little thing counts, which is, it is by creating waves of activity that real change happens. I don't know if you recall or are aware of Live Aid back in the 1980s.
I'm that old, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and some of your listeners will also. But that was something that started from an individual or a couple of individuals saying, "What the heck is going on in parts of Africa? These people are starving to death. We need to do something about it." And it built momentum simply by talking about it, by doing little things to kick something off. And it has meant that the plight of people in underdeveloped countries is recognized more readily now across the globe than had been before that. And not to say that there weren't activities happening, but not on the same scale, not on the same level of awareness, where people used their influence. And these were very specifically people who were in the music industry, and they had a lot of influence, but would typically have been quiet about these things prior to that. Each one of us can do something similar. We don't have to stand on a stage and shout it out to people, but by sharing our concerns with people, by sharing what we're doing and encouraging other people to get engaged and involved, that helps to progress the movement. I had a thought come to mind there in
Well,
relation.
you
Go
made a
ahead.
statement, and this isn't verbatim, but it goes something like this. This is what I'm concerned about, and this is what I'm doing about it. And then that prompts conversation. So
Mhm.
my follow-up question then would be, who are you having these conversations with? Are you having them with specific people or specific groups? Like, are you going to a church, or are you putting yourself on stage and say, hey, you know, I am concerned about this, and this is what I'm doing?
Well, the reality is we don't even need to go to those extremes, and the reason why is there's been a number of surveys, and there's one very interesting one that was done in the US actually, in 2021. I think they did a kind of a repeat of it in 2022 as well, and it was asking the question, do you believe more needs to be done about climate change?
Hmm.
And a significant majority of people said, yes, we do believe more needs to be done about climate change. And they asked the question, are you concerned about climate change? I am concerned about climate change. Do you believe others around you are concerned about climate change? No, most people said. So a large majority or a moderate majority of people said we need to take action on climate. We need climate policies. We need transition of energy. A much lower percentage of people said other people are concerned about this. So the reality is, your next door neighbor, your colleague at work, the people you play five-a-side soccer with, whatever it happens to be, many of them are the same people as, same types of people as you are, and therefore have the same concerns, but we don't talk about it. They dug into the details of this and said, ignorance of the perspective or the perception of other people has actually held us back from doing something. And they made a really good example, actually, in one of the articles I read. They talked about, if you're in a room with six people, in a meeting room with six people, and it's really oppressively warm, you look around the room and only one or two other people appear to be too warm, the likelihood of you getting up to open the window is a lot less than if everybody in the room looks like they're warm and you feel comfortable doing that. So it's interesting how I kind of use the analogy, we prefer to be sheep. We prefer to be led by somebody else. We don't always want to be the adventurer out front. We prefer to look to somebody else for some validation before we take action. And that's a behavior that we see across society in many instances, until somebody else looks to be doing something similar or the same, even though it's something we desire or something we want to do something about, or we feel we need to do something about, we're not necessarily inclined to do so until we see that other individual or individuals also doing the same thing. So therefore, starting a conversation to say, I think you should do this about climate change, is not really going to be something that, one, would be accepted by whoever you're speaking to, but two, most people would be comfortable with. But if they say something like, I'm concerned about climate change and this is something I do, it can start a discussion. And in that instance, then there's another person who thinks, oh, I'm not the only person. And it grows and grows and grows. And I think that's one of the fundamental areas in terms of leadership, which is not a hard step to take. I mean, it's easy for me. I'm passionate about it. But I also I'm not the type of person who's going to shove it down somebody's throat either. I've had conversations where somebody just isn't interested. That's fine. They're not interested. There are other people who are. That's where my time is better spent. And I've always been a proponent in my professional life, which bleeds into my personal life, of putting my effort in where it makes sense to put it in. But I think that's ultimately where our biggest impact can be, is creating that awareness around us, and then looking at, well, what can I do? And once I do, so let's say, for instance, I don't know whether I mentioned this previously. We did some investigation into the impacts of various activities. And in Ireland, for instance, if 50% of people in Ireland ate one less beef meal a week for a year, it would be the equivalent of taking every Irish car in Ireland, or every private car in Ireland, off the road for 6 months.
Yeah, we had that. Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I totally remember that.
Okay.
And because it's such a unique, metaphor for how to approach this idea of
It
we can
is,
make a
because
change
it's
because
small
it's
things.
practical.
Exactly. It's practical. It's small things that people can do. But when you add it up, it makes a difference. The thing is, when we dug into the data and got comfortable with that, it made us a lot more comfortable to answer questions and to talk to people about it in the early stages of us starting this initiative. Because, as I said, I'm not an environmental scientist, a climate scientist, or anything like that. I have perspectives and I have understanding based upon what I've read or what I've heard. But once I got into this in multiple different areas, just that I do in my own life, then I started to get more confident to talk about it. So if somebody did ask a question, I could give them something that was useful, that I knew was accurate, and therefore they could have a certain amount of confidence that that what they were hearing was of value, and therefore they could possibly do something about it themselves. And that's the model that we'd love to see. That's a model of leadership that will encourage vast change, because there are a lot of people out there doing a lot of good stuff around climate technology, for instance. There's a lot of investment in climate technology. It's the adoption of some of this stuff that needs to be sped up, and that's usually down to existing industry or governments to encourage the right policies to mean that those technologies are adopted, or we put more emphasis onto making the transition towards, and the big one is energy, cleaner energy, for instance. But if every politician in a position of power is only hearing the lobby from the existing industry, that is the direction that they're going to take. Whereas if they're hearing from those people who voted to put them into the positions of power that they're in, then the balance of it tips the scales in terms of that willingness to change and feel like they're supported to change, because most politicians are trying to ensure that they're in their position over a longer period of time. They know there's a vote in 2 years, 4 years, whatever it might happen to be. So they can't afford to go against what they think the common consensus is. So therefore, if we make the common consensus that we want to see action, then that should result in such action happening.
So what happens in 2023? Where is Damien Mulligan and his team going to be, and what are you doing?
So
What's the
right
next
now,
step?
right now, what we're doing is, the early stage idea was that we create an app to do this, and I think that is longer term what we will do.
Okay.
Right now, though, what we're doing is we're putting an emphasis on digging a little deeper into the problem for individuals. What are the things we can do for individuals, particularly with climate anxiety, to help them get to a point where they're comfortable living with the anxiety or reducing that anxiety, and then encourage them and give them guidance on what are the steps they can take as individuals that will help to make a difference. So what we're probably going to do first is survey a number of companies to understand the issues that some of these companies might face. They may not even be aware of that they're facing at the moment, in terms of their employee engagement or even their employees' personal state of mind that might affect their work. Because anxiety can affect us in multiple different ways. For some people, it might be a lack of sleep. For others, it can be a lack of focus, inability to focus on work tasks or on school tasks or whatever might happen to be. For others, it impacts how they engage socially with others. So if we can dig into some of those, understand in a little more detail the behaviors or the challenges they face related to climate, then we can certainly encourage them around not necessarily the negative element, but the positive element, the direction we can take,
Right.
And give them a sense that there are solutions to the problem, a sense that they can manage the feeling of anxiety themselves by getting engaged and helping to solve the problem. And by doing that, we are helping to solve the problem. And so therefore, we intend to engage with companies to survey and potentially deliver then courses or trainings to their staff that'll help them feel comfortable in the context of their own lives, that'll encourage them to be more fulfilled individuals. And we hope from that then that we'll target very specific areas and to scale this. And you mentioned earlier it needs to be on a global scale. My vision is that in 10 years' time, there will be 1 billion people on a platform engaged and active on various activities around climate. I think big when I think about these things, but I don't
Well, that's
think
a good number to have.
well, listen, it's an eighth of the planet's inhabitants. So it's a pretty massive number, but at the same time, we have in most countries between 50 and 70% of people who are aware of climate change and want to see change happen. The percentage of people who with eco anxiety is probably lower than that, is probably closer to 30 or 40%.
Okay.
but that's pretty high as well, you know. So therefore, these are people who not only are aware of the problem, but I feel can be motivated in many cases to do something about it because their level of awareness causes them such concern that they want to do something about it. And that's where we want to be in 2023 is getting between 5 and 10,000 people engaged and active in various different ways. And I do believe if we can hit that number, then it will rapidly grow beyond that.
Well, I'm going to end this conversation by saying I would like to be a part of that number. And
Very good.
and we have been on the call for more than 30 minutes, but a lot has going on here and it is greatly appreciated. And so like I said, I think even before the call, I could have conversations with you all the time because there's nothing that you can't talk about. And it's always a pleasure to have a
I don't know
conversation
whether
with
that's
you.
a good thing or a bad thing if there's nothing I can't talk about, but I do appreciate it. I mean, I think this, as I mentioned, this is something I'm passionate about, but I believe that given my experience, my professional experience and the expertise that I've developed around change management and understanding people and motivating people and the leadership element, that this is something I can have an impact on, and I want to have an impact. I will have an impact on it.
I
So
like
thank you
that.
very much for giving me the time to speak to your listeners.
And as always, you are very welcome. So we may need to do it again and again and again if you let me join your team and we can make an impact together in my own way. I could certainly try to help.
Absolutely.
At least here in the United States. And because I don't want to see my house fall into the ocean, and I'm close enough where that can possibly happen in 10 years.
Absolutely. And what I will say is I've talked about some stuff here as well. What I'll do is I'll give you a couple of links for people to put maybe you can put in the comments when you publish this so that people can refer to it. I want it to be clear that this is not just my opinion, that there's science behind all of this
Right.
and there's facts behind it as well. So therefore, I'd welcome people to check out those as well if they want some more detail. I don't do it particularly justice because I'm a big picture sort of kind of guy, but I think that'll be useful for your viewers as well.
Cool. Well, I appreciate it. Let's go ahead and end this conversation. So this has been another edition of the Question Guy podcast. Damien, thank you much for being part of this show. And for those who are listening and watching, we'll see you next time. Take care.